Hello, everyone. This is your professor here. For most of these debates, my primary intention is to get students to think about the issues and just kind of consider the best arguments that can be brought up from either side. In this particular debate, Is Policing Racially Biased? I actually think that some of the most significant details of the conversation have been left out. And so in my seated classes, this is the one debate where I tell my students, I'm going to be trying to convince you of something. I'm going to try to convince you that there is a real ethical problem at hand here. Now, that's not to say that I think that you guys should take everything that I say as absolute, or to try to take this as me trying to indoctrinate you one way or another. I believe that there are good reasons for the position that I generally will try to defend in this position, in this debate. And so what I'm going to do in this debate, given that you guys have just completed watching through the debate, I'm going to go back through and just kind of identify some of the topics and conversations that I would generally bring up if we were doing this kind of in a seated environment where we were having some interaction, interplay. So what I'd like you to do is just listen to this debate, and at the end of or listen to this discussion about the debate, and at the end I will ask you to respond to a couple of questions in paragraph form to complete the assignment. So let's move forward. So the first speaker in the debate that again, if you have not watched the debate yet, I want you to go and re-watch the debate first and then come back and watch this conversation. It's going to assume that you guys have an idea of the topics that we're talking about already, and they came up in the debate context. So the first speaker was Mark Claxton. Mark Claxton had three primary steps to his presentation. He was a police officer in New York City. The first thing he wanted to do is distinguish between bias and prejudice, and I think this was a really important distinction to kind of identify right up front. He identified bias as a predisposition, in particular in this debate of law enforcement, but it doesn't matter if we're talking about law enforcement or anybody else. It's a predisposition to treat people differently based upon circumstances that are not necessarily intentional. Okay, so you have bias when you are treating one group differently than another group. A prejudice is going to occur when that bias is based on an intentionality or a targeting. Okay? So, in other words, something can be biased without there being an intention behind the bias. But if there is an intention behind the bias, and if it has kind of a malicious intention to it, then you're dealing with prejudice. Claxton is setting up this distinction here because he wants us to make sure that he's not trying to argue that policing is prejudice, that there has to be some ill intent behind the police officers or the system itself towards minorities. Rather, that what he's just trying to argue is that the way the law is actually enforced functions as a bias against minority communities. So it's a lesser challenge that he has to defend. His first argument that he brings up after he makes this distinction between bias and prejudice is that one needs to consider contextual factors alongside statistical data. His argument is that when you consider both factors, data and context, that what you'll end up inferring from this is that policing is biased, and if you deny it, you would have to be both intellectually dishonest to the data as well as insensitive to people who have undergone all these experiences that seem to support the claim. So again, this is his statement up front. He doesn't really present any defense for this. This is the kind of thing that we'd have to look back to later on after we've gone through the debate. And of course, nobody wants to be intellectually dishonest or personally insensitive, and so he's making a pretty strong claim here that you don't want to be on the side of the position that leaves you in those categories. His second argument is that institutional biases make it harder for law enforcement to do their jobs well. And I think this was a really important point. And again, he doesn't really drive it home, but here's why it's important. he's not trying to pit a situation where you have like the police department against the minority community. He's not trying to get you to side and say, well, you need to choose for the negative of the police department in favor of in favor of making things right for the minority community. He's saying that the situation, the institutional situation we have right now, is bad for everyone. That it makes things significantly worse for citizens and minority communities, but it also makes things significantly worse for police officers who are just trying to do their jobs and have been put into a situation where their form of policing that they're required to do makes their circumstances more dangerous. And so we're going to come back and we'll reflect on that again later on. One thing to note about Mark Claxton's discussion, it really wasn't presented as an intention, as I don't think it was intended to try to be convincing on its own. I think he was really just setting up the conversation that's going to happen. And we can say the same thing for his counterpart, Harry Stern, who is a lawyer and was also for a time a police officer, and he's arguing that there is no bias in policing. And he offered us three primary arguments. The first one was that one must let the data speak for itself without any concern for context. So his argument is directly in contrast with the argument that we saw of Officer Claxton, that if you try to bring in contextual factors, you're going to skew the issue, and these anecdotes are going to kind of give us an idea that there's a problem that really there isn't in the real world. And so he's saying that when we listen to context too heavily, we're going to make problems seem like they're bigger than they are. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, and he doesn't give his argument for that directly here. This is going to be something that comes up later on as well, and so I just want you to hold on to that idea. Argument number two that he brings up, policing in black communities as a response to high crime in those communities. Again, in general, we're going to be going back and forth between referring to minority communities or black communities. Primarily, this debate is going to be focused on black communities and the data that happens in those. But I believe it can be replicated in other neighborhoods as well, particularly Hispanic neighborhoods in some of the major cities. But we'll focus on the debate where it's happening in this context here with black communities. So. All right, so his qualification here is that even though high crimes in these communities, he wants us to not take that as meaning that black people as a whole are more criminal people, and I think that's a good qualification that he makes there. And then he brings up this really weird justification about commentary about spontaneous generation, and he's presenting a position as if maybe his opponents would be arguing that crime is magically appearing in these communities because policing is there. And he's saying, no, the policing is there because the crime is there. And so when you have high crime in communities, where else would you want the police to go? That's his major question here. Police shouldn't be wasting their time in communities where there's where there's not crime. They should be focusing on communities where there's crime, and his argument is that these are primarily black communities. So we'll come back to this one later as well. And his third argument, unjustified claims that policing is racially biased are dangerous not only for the police officers but the citizenry. And so you can see this as kind of a concession or an agreement with what we just saw from Officer Claxton, that sometimes, that this situation is not really a matter of picking sides about who do you want to make life better for, the police or the community. Both groups of people believe that if you come to understand the situation and their own of racial bias correctly, that it's better for everyone. They just disagree about what seeing it correctly means. And so we'll unpack this as we go along. So Claxton and Stern, they're really just setting up the discussion. They don't give us the arguments. The real arguments come in with the academics that we consider. Gloria Brown Marshall is a first, and she's going to argue in favor of policing being racially biased. In other words, she's going to say that policing is racially biased in America. And then we'll look at her counterpart, Heather McDonald. So let's start with Gloria Brown Marshall. Now, Gloria brought up two primary arguments. First one is that racial bias in policing has already been proven in the courts. And the second one is that racial bias has been a traditional duty of American policing. So it's actually part of the role that they've played historically in America. So let's focus on point number one right here. She argues that racial bias in policing has already been proven in the courts at three different levels. The first level that she identifies is the state level. She talks about the Floyd case in New York. We're going to talk about that shortly. The second level is in the federal level when she talks about the determinations of of Eric Holder, who is the Attorney General. And then the third level is internationally when she talks about the circumstances with the UN. So let's start with the Floyd case. The Floyd case, as they mentioned at some point in this debate, was a case that happened in New York City that had to do with the concept of stop and frisk. Okay, so stop and frisk was a practice that had been used in New York for many, many years. You may have heard this topic come up if you paid any attention to the Democratic primaries, when there was a lot of trouble for Mayor Bloomberg when he finally entered the race on this matter. As a matter of fact, I think stop and frisk was one of the largest reasons why he was never going to be able to get off the ground against somebody like Joe Biden. So stop and frisk, here's basically how it works. There was a case in Ohio in the 1960s. It was called Terry versus Ohio. And in that particular case, the law enforcement was arguing that they need to have the right to be able to stop somebody on suspicion that they are representing, or they match the description of somebody who committed some serious crime. And the idea here was that you didn't have time to go get a warrant or try to make a case for yourself, but there's an imminent threat or an imminent danger in play. So imagine the kind of context that they had in mind. Ontario versus Ohio was that if there was a bank robbery, armed bank robbery up the street, and you have a description of the person who committed the robbery, and it happened, within the last 10 minutes, that if you see somebody who matches that description, you need to be able to stop them while the evidence is still on them, including the gun, the money, and all of this sort of things. And the idea here is that this person is an imminent threat. They just threatened somebody with a deadly weapon, and you need to stop them. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be able to solve the crime and catch the culprit. And so the police, the law enforcement was given the right in those circumstances to go forward and say, hey, you match the description, come over here, let me check you, pat you down, make sure that you don't have this weapon, that you don't have, the money that was stolen from the bank, and we can kind of rule you out as a suspect. That was the idea. Well, this was the original version of it. In the 90s and early 2000s in New York City, this became something much more expanded. What was happening was that millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people over the course of a particular year, millions of people over the course of the institution of this, were being stopped and frisked. And the idea was that these people were being stopped and frisked on the basis of really generic data or information. And so somebody would say something like, "Look, there was a mugging that happened, 6 blocks from here, 2 nights ago. You matched the description. The description is black male, 18 to 35 years old, between 5'9" and 6'1", somewhere between 160 and 215 pounds." Right? And so these descriptions are so vague that virtually, 20% of the population would meet these descriptions, and the stop and frisk were being implemented after a time period where, the person who committed these crimes is not really appropriately conceived of as an imminent threat. I mean, you don't even know a couple days later whether this person's anywhere near the area, let alone like walking the streets. And so all of this, these generic descriptions led to a situation where, members of the black community in particular, but also the Hispanic community in New York City, were being stopped just primarily because they matched this broad general description, and they were being checked, and many of them were being were walking around with, pot or something like that on them, and they were accruing criminal charges for these circumstances, even though they had nothing at all to do with the initial criminal act of the mugging that was used as justification for stopping them. So that's the situation that's going on. Why was this case? Why was the Floyd case used to show that that there's racial bias in policing? Well, this has to do with the Fourth Constitutional Amendment. And the Fourth Constitutional Amendment says this: the right of the people. It gives people the right to be secure in their persons, houses, and papers and effects. And that right is to stand against unreasonable searches and seizures. And you shouldn't violate this right. And you shouldn't have any warrants upon this unless you have probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched or the persons to be seized. Okay? So let's walk through the important parts of this here. The first is the right of the people to be secure in their persons. The idea here is that you as a person have a right not to be searched on your person. Okay, so whatever's within your pockets or that you've got, in other kind of areas of your person, like under your clothing or any of that, what's in your hand, what's in your mouth, and other places, right? These are places that you're not able to search, okay? Nor is somebody able to search, if you go forward, houses, papers, and effects. So again, where does this kind of play out? Your house, we all know what that is. Your house is your dwelling. So a police officer can't just walk up into your house and start looking around. Your papers. Now, papers is a weird thing. Like, we don't think about our identification as papers, but that's what this is referring to. It's talking about things like your driver's license, your passport, your forms of identification. You have a constitutional right, according to the Fourth Amendment, not to hand over your identification if it's requested by police officers. Now, I should caveat this, that if you're driving a car, there's kind of a higher level of obligation. You have to prove that you have the right to drive that car if you've committed a crime and been pulled over for that. But if you're a passenger in a car, if you're standing on a street corner, no law enforcement official has the right to request your identification without some form of warrant that's specifically identifying you as the person they're looking for. Likewise, your effects, that would be things like your purse, your wallet, things that you're carrying around stuff in. You're not able to be checked in this. I guess you can count whether or not you count your clothing as an effect or or part of your person. I think there's a little bit of vagueness there, but it doesn't matter because both of those are considered here. So a police officer can't just walk up to you, according to the Fourth Amendment, without a warrant and without an oath or affirmation of support from higher levels of law enforcement, from the judicial branch, judges. They can't just say, "Hey, you come here. I'm going to search you," and then take from you or charge you with anything that they find. They don't have the right to do that unless they have some probable cause that you are in fact the person who committed some particular crime. Okay, so again, the whole Terry versus Ohio thing, or the stop and frisk policies, really hinge on what we count as probable cause. And the challenge was that, look, you can't meet probable cause just because you happen to be between 5'9" and 6'1", 160 and 215 pounds, black male between 18 and 35 years old. That's not sufficient for probable cause, was the argument that's made here. So why is this important? Well, what ended up happening was a lot of people were identified according to their like they're fitting into these generic characterizations as falling under the probable cause doctrine here, and they were. And that was ruled that they were being unreasonably searched because this is not satisfying for probable cause, right? And what's more is that this last condition was not being affirmed or recognized by law enforcement, which is that you're supposed to particularly describe the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized before you go on with the search. So here's the circumstances that we have here. You have members of the black community from young teenagers on up to through young adults and further than that. I mean, but that's the primary range that we're talking about here. Something like 11, 12 years old up to mid-30s. They're being searched, and you're finding on them recreational drug paraphernalia and that sort of thing, and they're receiving charges for the possession of these items. Okay, but they're being questioned under the pretense that they were involved in a violent crime or something that involves an imminent threat to society. And they're not being told, hey, I'm going to look on you to find these particular drugs in this particular region. They're just being generally patted down. And if somebody finds drugs, of course, the police have to take them, but they're also being cited for this. So being brought in and brought up on charges of drug possession. And that's where the problem really hinges, because the policy was getting people to be convicted of crimes or to be charged with and usually convicted, but most of these convictions take the form of plea bargains, right? So you're getting these plea deals for crimes that you are committing, right? And so there's a sense in which the people who are getting these charges and getting these convictions and making these plea deals, they are guilty of a crime, but they should have never been caught of this because the pretenses for their being found guilty were a violation of the Fourth Constitutional Amendment. That's the idea that's going on here. So you might ask yourself, okay, well, this is a problem. Why is this in the racial bias argument against the policing in America? And the reason for this is that the statistics on these search and seizures found that 85% of them were being performed on the Black and Latino population in New York City, whereas only 52% of New York's population was in fact Black and Latino. So we see that your prevalence, your racial profile ends up leading to a higher prevalence of you being searched as opposed to the alternative communities. That's why this became recognized. That's why the Floyd case went in favor of those arguing for racial bias here. The other two arguments that were brought up, policing is racially biased in many places throughout the country, was the statement of the U.S. Justice Department, and again that comes through the claims of Eric Holder, who was Attorney General under the Obama administration, and in particular, that was a statement that was made in reaction to the events that were happening in Ferguson, Missouri. And then the United Nations, the statement that was made there, policing in the U.S. is racially biased. And their claim is that a systematic ideology of racism ensuring the domination of one group over another, continues to negatively impact on the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. Again, that was a statement that was also made in reaction to the events of Ferguson. And so you have these pronouncements of these higher legal communities about racial bias. And so from Gloria Brown Marshall's standpoint, she says, look, the courts, these are the experts in law. And the courts at both the state and federal levels, as well as the international courts, they all acknowledge the same thing. Racial bias is real. So if the experts on legal matters all agree about racial bias being real in policing, that should be enough to settle this debate, because this is a question about legality and the experts are already on our side. So this is, on the face of it, a really strong argument that needs to be considered. And I'm not going after the critical elements now. We're going to see this argument being attacked. You guys already watched the video. You know this argument gets challenged. I'll bring up the challenges in their time in this discussion here, so just bear with me on that. The second argument that Gloria Brown Marshall makes is the historical argument, where what does she say? I'm going to go through 400 years of history in a minute and a half, right? And she goes through many significant historical moves, right? She talks about the initiation of the police departments in places like New England and St. Louis, where she says that the initial police departments were night watches that were, intended to really round up slaves and these sorts of things, which is not exactly true. The police departments were actually developed as night watches concerning Native Americans, but the racial component is obviously there. She's not, I don't want to kind of pick apart her argument too much here, because it really does systematically fit in with what she's trying to say. In the police departments or the slave patrols, they started right here in the Carolina colony to enforce state and federal slave codes as an economic protection measure. We know, in more recent history, that Jim Crow segregation was enforced by policing departments. And so she's got a lot of data behind her here. Some of the most problematic data comes up when she brings up the context of the 13th Constitutional Amendment. And here's what she said there. And this is where we're really going to see racial bias playing itself out in law enforcement. So the 13th Amendment was the amendment that was outlawing slavery. And when we think about the 13th Amendment, we might think, well, that was obviously a good move towards solving racial injustice problems. Everybody admits that slavery was a huge racial injustice problem, right? And so the 13th Constitutional Amendment, which came after the Civil War, says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any other place subject to their jurisdiction. The key little component phrase here is except as punishment for a crime. And whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So, we look at that and we say, okay, well, the idea behind this is that you can allow criminals to be used as labor forces to kind of justify their own continued incarceration costs or something like that. That's the idea of what's going on here. And I don't think a whole lot of people in principle would look at this and say, well, there's a huge injustice that's going on here. Look, it costs money to keep criminals alive by feeding them, to give them health care, and room and board, and to pay for the security guards, right? I mean, it seems like there could be some justification made for making them work off their debt to society. So that's the idea that was going behind this. The problem is there wasn't very much specificity of what kind of crimes we're talking about and what does it mean to be duly convicted here. See, we saw plenty of problems during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow area where even though the statement itself is not intrinsically racially unjust, the application of it was generally allowed to be. So just let me give you some examples of laws that were put into the books during the Reconstruction era. Okay, so here's one. It was illegal. It was made illegal after the end of slavery for a farm worker to walk beside the railroad. Now, there's no statement about them doing anything other than walking in this law. So we have to ask ourselves, well, is that really a racially biased law, or is that just a bad law? Well, let's think about who would have been walking beside railroads in the early Reconstruction period. So where are the railroads going to be running? The railroads are often going to be running in areas next to large plantations. Why? Because the railroads were used to move goods from the south to the north during this time period. So whether it be cotton, tobacco, or whatever other goods that you have here, these goods needed to be picked up from somewhere, and they didn't have automobiles. They couldn't, you didn't have a trucking system where you can just load up trucks and move them from one stop to another stop. They had to go pretty close to the plantations to be able to do their pickups, so they can take that material up north and be able to sell it in the northern states. And so you had railroads that would be running pretty close to plantations. Now, plantations were where the slaves were living during the period of slavery, right? They lived on site on these plantations. Oftentimes they'd have their own dwelling places on these plantations, but they would live on property. After slavery was ended, for many of these plantations, the people who were formerly slaves, they didn't want to live on the plantations anymore, and there was going to be animosity between the former slave owners and the former slaves as well. And many of the former slave owners, the plantation owners, they didn't want the slaves to be living on their property anymore either. If they didn't own them, they couldn't control them absolutely. They were going to make life harder for them than for fighting for this right to be freed. And so what ended up happening is these communities were popping up outside of these major areas, oftentimes in wooded areas or underdeveloped areas, where the black community would kind of come together, the former slave community would come together and kind of establish their own little neighborhoods, if you'll call them that, like mini cities or something like that. And oftentimes these things would be generated, they would be developed and built near railroads as well, for obvious reasons. Some might have looked at this as saying, well, maybe we can kind of hop on a train that's going by and not have to walk 3 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles to get home. But probably more common is that a lot of these people were thinking, well, the railroads they've been built in places that are open, they're exposed. You can see what's going on there. Trees have been cut down, it's straight past, you can't get lost in the woods. It was really dangerous to be lost in the woods as a former slave during that period of time because, again, there were people who might be out hunting you, it'd be no witnesses and that sort of thing. And so these areas, because they were clear and because they provided a clear directional path to go where you wanted to go, it would be easy for you to know where you were heading, how close you were to home, and all these sorts of things, and to get there safely generally. And so this would be the way that most of these folks would make their way from the plantation into work in the morning and home at night. And now it was made illegal to walk beside this railroad, which means that the people who had previously intended to walk this path, now they were going to be forced to walk through the woods, which is, again, dangerous because there's no witnesses to anything that can happen. You don't really see what's going on, and you might not even know exactly where you are because it's a little bit more disorienting when you don't have the kind of straight landmark that a railroad represents. All right, so that was one law that was written. And clearly that wasn't going to have any impact on the white community, and obviously there is no clear problem with somebody who's a farm worker walking beside a railroad. I mean, this doesn't seem to have any direct implication with criminality, and so that was pretty bad. Another law that was written up was it was illegal to speak loudly in the presence of white women. Now, this is a strange law. Again, it's not immediately racial, right? It doesn't say if you're a white person who speaks in the presence of white women loudly, then you can, then you don't have to worry about this. But if you're a black individual who does, then you do, right? It's not explicitly racist in that way, but at the same time, like I want you to try to imagine how many white men were arrested on this law, right? And the answer is going to be basically zero. It was also illegal to sell the products of your farm after dark. This is a new law that was put in the books after Reconstruction. So why do you think they put this law forward? Well, let's think about what the former slaves were doing for a living now. They were still farming, but they were still farming on the same properties that they had previously been enslaved on. They were sharecroppers now, though, which means that they received a portion of the crop as restitution, as payment for their work, right? They weren't paid in cash. That's not how things worked back then. They didn't have these kind of economies like we have today. They were paid in crops. Now, what do you think the farm owners required of them as far as their hourly labor went? If you said they would work from sun up to sundown, then you would be right. And generally speaking, this was going to be a 7-day-a-week job. So imagine the circumstances here. You work 7 days a week, sun up to sundown. Okay? You are paid in crop. That crop, oftentimes you would be paid in one type of crop, whether it be cotton or or tobacco or whatever. Maybe if you're working like corn or something like that. I don't know if they had corn in the southern states, but whatever you were working, like you would be paid in that particular crop. But you can't survive on cotton alone, right? You need to take that payment and use that as a way to trade or barter or sell it to get food and clothing and other things that you might need. But if you're not allowed to sell the products of your farming after dark, and you're working during all the light hours, basically what this law is doing is making it so that you're functionally not allowed to sell your products at all. And we can see that this is only going to impact the sharecropping community, the former slaves who were black citizens, right? And so they were the only ones that were going to be affected by these laws. Finally, and probably this is, in my opinion, this is the most flagrant of all of them, is the vagrancy statutes. They made it illegal in the Reconstruction South to be jobless. Okay, so if you were unemployed, you could be sent to prison. Now, I want you to imagine the circumstances of the sharecropper here. You're a sharecropper, which means now you're employed. If you were not employed, you can be put into jail. Okay? So what ends up happening is a lot of these plantation owners in the South, once these vagrancy statutes are in play, they realize, you know what? I can just take my sharecropper, fire him in front of the constable, have the constable charge him on the vagrancy statute, bring him to jail, and then I can hire out the labor from jail at a reduced rate so that I don't have to pay 10% of the crop share to this person, and I save money. And so the system was being gamed so that the sharecroppers could be fired and then put into jail and then turned back into slaves as soon as they've been convicted for not having jobs. Right? You can see the cycle of the penalty that's going to go on here. Basically, it becomes slavery under another name. Okay. So we recognize that in the convict lease system, which is what this is called, slavery, while it was officially gone, was kind of reintroduced in another form in the early American prison system that kind of developed in the Reconstruction era. And then we saw this going forward even more in the way that Jim Crow. In the way that the Jim Crow system worked in the South, where you had certain water fountains that were appropriate for the black community, you had certain areas on the buses that were appropriate, or it's deemed appropriate legally for the black communities, and we can recognize from all of this that these were clearly racially biased laws, and people really did suffer under these laws. Now, in reflection on all this, you might ask yourself, and I think this would be an appropriate question to ask once Gloria Brown Marshall is done talking. Okay, granted, we have a nation that has a severe history of racial injustice in the legal system. But what happened in the past is not the same thing always as what's happened in the future. And many people would say, look, we don't have slavery anymore. We don't have Jim Crow segregation. We don't have slave patrols. We don't have these same sorts of clearly racial injustices occurring at the legal level anymore. These are things that have been fixed. So while we can admit that these things have happened in the past before, we can also acknowledge they're not happening anymore. And so that should seem to be evidence that racial injustice has been suppressed. It's been suppressed throughout the years, and we're at a system now that is the most equal that we've ever had racially. That would be the argument that a lot of people would make, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that. But I don't think Gloria Brown Marshall's interest in presenting this history is to convince us that because these things happened in the past, therefore racial injustice is real now. What I think she really wants you to recognize is, look, these things have happened legally in the past. In other words, the legal system has been clearly racially unjust, historically speaking. And if that could happen in the past, then it could be happening today. Though we should also recognize that the story of the past has been one where you didn't just get rid of racial injustice. It went from an explicitly racially unjust system to an implicitly racially unjust system, and it's gotten more implicit historically as time has gone on. So her argument is going to be that whereas we would look at the 13th Amendment and on the face of it, it looks like it abolished racism or racial injustice, that if we take a deeper look, we recognize that the racial injustice is still actually happening. And I think she wants us to see that all that we've done is make racial injustice issues. Well, we've gotten better in a lot of ways at the explicit presentation of it, that we've left the possibility and the actuality of racial injustice in the present system in the form of kind of very subtle nuances of the way that the legal system works itself out. So this is the case that she's going to be making, and we're going to look at that as we go on further. Okay, so that was the third speaker, the primary set of arguments in favor of racial bias in policing. Then Heather McDonald comes in after Gloria Brown Marshall, and she gives us the three-part argument to say, no, racial bias is not present in policing. The first argument that she gives, she says the media is responsible for giving us a false understanding of the circumstances. This argument ties back into Harry Stern's argument, where he said that we need to pay attention to data, not contextual factors. Let's think about the media for a second. So if you want to kind of recap of what Heather McDonald's argument was here, she brought up statistics from 2015, and she said, look, in 2015 there were 991 victims of police shootings throughout America. Most of them were armed. Now, she doesn't give a statistic here, but she says most of them were armed. But what's more important, only 50% of them, 50% of these, the people who were involved, the citizens who were involved in police shootings, 50% of them were white, 26% of them were black. And she talked about a couple of different instances. One of the ones that really sticks in my mind is where one white individual was coming after officers with a spoon, and they were shot by the police officers, right, as being an impending threat. Now, here's the important feature of that. My guess is that none of you have ever heard of that situation. None of you have heard of that situation. We've heard of a number of situations of police shootings involving black citizens who are unarmed. Michael Brown is one of them, right? If you go back a little further, you can find Oscar Grant. You can look at what happened to Eric Garner up in New York City. You can look at other cases where there was a firearm that was in the vicinity, but it wasn't possessed. It wasn't being used violently towards police officers. So we had the case of Philando Castile. I think Philando Castile was the one who was up in Wisconsin or Minnesota or something like this. And then you have the case that happened here in Charlotte a couple years ago, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he had a gun on his leg, and he was shot by a police officer there. And so we hear these stories repeatedly about oftentimes young or middle-aged black men being shot by police officers, and we never hear the stories about the white ones. Right? And so her argument is that the media is driving this narrative to us that makes it look like there's a larger problem than there really is, right? When she says only 26% of police shootings involve black suspects, that's much closer to the overall population of the black community. And again, black community is 13% of American citizenry, and so we're still having a higher percentage than what is represented in the community in general. But again, it's 1 out of 4. Like, you would never guess that by watching the news, right? She's basically making the false news argument here, and there's a lot of truth to that. We've got to recognize that the media in our country, the way that our media is presented, and I am not an anti-media across the board sort of person. I think that you got to identify where media is being used for, where media is trying to be viciously or intentionally deceptive versus other situations, right? When a media presents data or stories about a police shooting, there's a reason that they're presenting that. It's not necessarily to stoke racism or those sorts of things, but they understand that these are the kinds of stories that have broad selling support, right? You can sell a lot of ads there. You can keep people watching with these sorts of stories. And so they'll choose to focus on the stories that will keep you coming back for more so that they can increase their revenue. Why do they do this? Because we've allowed in this country corporations to purchase media and to use them to make money, right? This has been generally a bad idea, I think. But you can see this happening. And I'll just give you kind of one instance of where this has really played itself out heavily in our own kind of timeline. And I'll compare the situation of the Michael Brown shooting to the situation of the Eric Garner choking. Okay, so Michael Brown, the Ferguson story, dominated the news cycle in late 2014. And again, I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't have been a story, okay? So what I'm suggesting is it was dominant in the storyline. You heard about Michael Brown and Officer Darren Wilson and all of these circumstances. You saw, all of a sudden the riots were developing and all of this, partly because so much attention was being paid to all this stuff. And people saw it as an opportunity to kind of, get the message stoked. I've always wondered to myself, why was so much focus during this time on Michael Brown? Why didn't that focus go more towards Eric Garner? Or even in another situation that happened in the same time frame, Tamir Rice. Okay, Eric Garner, his whole situation was caught on videotape. We know for a fact that what happened to Eric Garner was a clear instance of racial of injustice towards what Eric Garner's position. He was selling cigarettes, or he was selling cigarettes individually outside of a shop, and he was accosted and arrested because he was evading taxes, right? And he wasn't fighting back, but he was still choked to death, primarily because he was a very large individual. But he wasn't fighting back. We know what happened there. We can see what the police officers did was clearly wrong. Same thing for the Tamir Rice case. Tamir Rice was I think he was a 12-year-old black male, and he was playing with a toy gun in the park, and somebody made a call about him, and even in the call they said, I think it's a toy, but I'm not sure, it's kind of scary. He had the little orange piece broken off of the tip of that gun. So, I mean, in fairness to the police officers, the gun wasn't clearly a toy. It was missing the piece that usually designates these as a toy. But police officers showed up here, and within seconds, they had shot and killed Tamir Rice. Now, they weren't in any direct threat, neither were any citizens, and yet, and most people admit that when you look at the statistics or the data of this case, you realize that the action of the police officers here was an unjustified action. Okay, so these are two situations that happened pretty much at the same time as Michael Brown that were clear instances of malpractice on the law enforcement, and yet the one we focus on is Michael Brown, which there is no video. There are conflicting reports on the ground of whether or not Michael Brown was charging Darren Wilson or whether he wasn't charging Darren Wilson. So basically, the narrative portion of this was open. And that is a situation that allowed for both sides to come in and spin their own story about what actually happened, which again creates a situation where there's a lot of doubt and there's a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of controversy, and the media is going to play these kind of stories because they don't want stories where there's black and white. They want controversy, they want questions, they want people to be coming back thinking, what's going to happen next? And so they focus on these things because that's better for their bottom line. And this is the point that's being made that by Gloria Brown, by Heather McDonald here, is that the media will choose for us the stories that we focus on for their own benefit of getting you to come back for more, primarily because these are the stories where the answer is not clear. That's not presenting news, that's presenting fodder, right, more than anything. And so that's what she's charging. Now, obviously, the big challenge, it can come back to that, is wait a minute. There's still 26% of those police shootings are happening towards black individuals. They only make up 13% of the population, so they're twice as likely, based on their population totals, to be targeted by police officers and get caught up in this. And Heather McDonald's response here is that policing in black communities is a response to high crime in those communities. The reason that those suspects are involved at a higher rate is because black victims die of homicide at 6 times the rate of other races, and because black suspects commit homicide at 8 times the rate of others. And so if you're committing homicides at those astronomically higher rates, it would be much more likely that you would be confronted by law enforcement in these situations where violence would be the end result. I mean, if we're talking a violent suspect being 8 times, you're 8 times more likely, okay, 8 times more likely to be black if you're a murderer. Okay, so again, that's not saying that's not saying there are 8 times as many murderers within the black community. What it's saying is that if you take 9 murder suspects, okay, nine people who've committed homicide, 8 of those 9 are going to be, let me think about how this is going to work out. If you're going to pick out 100 people from, I don't know, let's put it that way. What's the best way to put this? Relative to their population. Okay, so if you take the 13% of the population that is of the black population, okay, in America, that population is, if you're an individual in that population, there are going to be 8 times as many murders percentage-wise over that population, murderers, as there are in the 63%, of the white population. So if, let's say, if you had 1% of the population in the white community be murderers, you would find that 8% of the black population would be murderers. That would be how it goes. Now, those are not the correct numbers. I want to make that very clear. I'm just trying to make it easy math for us to follow it. That's the idea. The homicide rates in these communities are significantly higher. And so she argues that, if anything, that a ton of restraint is shown in that it's only double the population that's involved in these police shootings. That when in reality, I mean, it can be 8 times the number, and that would reflect appropriately on the violent crime that happens in the community. So that's the idea that goes there. Basically, the heart of the argument in favor that's arguing against policing being racially biased is going to be this set of statistics, that there's more violence in the black communities, and that's where we want the cops to be. And if there's more violence in those communities, and we want cops to prosecute violent crimes, or to enforce the laws on violent crimes, you're going to have this situation where the black community is going to be incarcerated at higher rates, and they're going to be encountered by police officers at higher rates. And so the data that shows that is reactive to the crime itself. That's the idea. And finally, argument number 3, she says policing in black communities is also a response to requests from law-abiding citizens in these communities. So again, like when you have a regular citizen coming in and complaining about truancy, loitering, drug activity, and those sorts of things, obviously we don't want law-abiding citizens to be ignored by law enforcement. They're making calls and saying, you need to come get these people. And again, these people is not a racial term here, because you're oftentimes talking about black communities. You're talking about black citizens and black communities calling on other black citizens in these communities and saying, there are, people outside who are selling drugs. I feel unsafe. Like, you want the law enforcement to protect these people. That's the idea. The people who are calling in the request. That's the idea. Just like you would in any racial community, you would expect that the job of the police department is to protect and serve. That's the idea. Okay, so her argument is pretty strong. Police are where the crime is. The crime is in the black communities, and you wouldn't get the feeling that police also go and enforce crime in white communities too, but the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of white people that are involved in officer-involved shootings as well. And so when we put all this together, we realize that you can't trust the narrative that comes to you from the media. You got to look at the statistics, and the statistics overwhelmingly support the fact that police are in more close contact with the black community in a lot of these situations. Okay. So that's the heart of her argument. Once we get into the moderator questions, we can start to unpack some of these things. We can start to see how these sides would react to one another. The first question the moderator brings up is, how does one explain away the legal victories concerning racial bias in policing? And Heather McDonald, first, she argues that the UN is not a credible source, right? She says, look, the United Nations, they're an international body. They don't have anything to do with our legal system. We have disagreements with the United Nations about lots of things, and we should be able to govern ourselves. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. She's right. We should be able to govern ourselves. But let's not forget that we do support the UN in a particular role throughout the world. And one of the major roles that they play is to be a peacekeeping force that lets us know when there are radical injustices that are happening in other parts of the world. So the UN's going to be the first source that comes to us when they want to report that genocide's happening in Rwanda or something like that, right? When there's some group of people that's being systematically oppressed by another group of people. This is what we pay them to do. And so when they point the finger at us, we need to make sure that we don't just dismiss them as being some separate body. They're actually doing what we generally accept that they should be doing, as long as they're not looking at us. So we got to play that part and role. Now, that's not to say that they're not a political entity. If they're pointing fingers, politics is often involved in these sorts of things. We do want to investigate the claims, but we can't be just dismissive of them because they're an international institution. That would be unfair. But again, there is some truth that they don't get to determine for us what our rules are and what our applications are. So that's the first thing. She says that as far as I don't think she mentions the U.S. State Department, what the claims of Eric Holder. But I think Eric Holder, he was the Attorney General during Ferguson. He was a political person. He was appointed politically by Barack Obama. He's going to be on the left. This is a rallying cry issue for the left, and so you can kind of get out from under you can get out from the strength of that argument by talking about the politics involved as well, kind of like they did with the UN one. But again, I'm going to caution that we need to take those claims individually and think about what they're applying to. You can't just say, well, a Democrat made that claim, therefore it's biased. That we do too much of that in our whole political conversations that we have today. We need to think about the arguments in their own rights. Okay. Now, because there wasn't a whole lot of support given about the UN or a whole lot of support given about what the State Department said, I don't think that Heather McDonald has really an obligation to respond deeply to those claims. But there was a lot of support given about the Floyd case, about the stop and frisk policies, and so she's going to refer to that more specifically in her challenge here. And here's what she has to say about the Floyd case. She believes that case was skewed because the courts used a population benchmark to consider the statistical data rather than a crime data benchmark to consider the statistical data. So basically, here's what she has in mind here. If you look at the stops that were being made in New York City, and you compare that to the crime rate, the violent crime rates in New York City, then you're going to have a much more appropriate comparison. So I think that, what do we say? It was 52% of New York City is minority, but they were comprising 85% of the stops. Well, the fact of the matter is that the violent crime within New York City was happening amongst the white community. It was like 2 or 3% of the population. And so her argument was going to be something along the lines of, look, like the right distribution of stops and stop and frisk should correspond with the distribution of violent crime. And so you shouldn't even have 15% of the stops be white community. Violent crime is 2 to 3% of the white community. You should expect virtually everybody to be stopped within the stop and frisk policy to be black or Hispanic, because that's who's committing the crimes. That's what her claim would be. And again, that's what the statistics would say. And so she says that you can't just look and say, well, 52% of the community or 48% of the community is white, so they should be 48% of the stops. No, if the white community is following the rules, then they shouldn't be the ones stopped. That was the claim that's being made. Okay. So again, I don't want to say that this is the end of the discussion. I think that we should still recognize that that wasn't the only feature of the stop and frisk practice that was under consideration. Yes, maybe it wasn't being used racially disproportionately to violent crime in general, but the question is, was it being used primarily to fight violent crime? And that's really the big question that we should have in play about whether or not that was an appropriate practice, right? It did seem to be used as a violation of the Fourth Constitutional Amendment. And also it did seem to be overused and inappropriately used because it wasn't being used in situations where there was an imminent threat. So while the judgment was probably correct against the use of stop and frisk, I think Heather McDonald has a pretty decent standing here to come back and say, there was some justification for the racial disproportionality, okay? At least on the face of it when we're talking about violent crime. If it had been applied correctly, and these are the statistics that we would see, that's not telling of a crime by itself, all right? The challenge comes in after this, where Gloria Brown Marshall says, look, we're not trying to argue that there's a vocalized policy of racial bias, but if we actually look at the results, the inappropriate treatment of supposed suspects and the inappropriate attitude of who the community belongs to, then we'll see policing bias working itself out. And what she's doing here is going back to some of the anecdotal claims, right? She's referring to something like Mark Claxton's discussion at the beginning, where he's thrown in the back of the police car and patted down on his way to training for becoming a police officer, or where we're talking about um, different kind of situations that come up where you can see police brutality happening in its worst, right? You think of the Rodney King beatings or something along those lines. She says, look, these things are happening, and you've got to hear these things happening. Uh, there's a lot of anecdotes that we can add on to this. I remember, as a part of referring to the attitude, the inappropriate attitude about the policing that happens, in St. Louis sometime after the let's see, was it before or after? I think it was shortly after the Michael Brown shooting and all of that uh, went up into play. There was another situation that happened in St. Louis, where there was a police officer, a pair of police officers, and they were in an unmarked car, and they were chasing down somebody who was a suspect in a carjacking. Okay, and so this person stole the car, and there was a high-speed chase going on, and the dash cam within the police officer's vehicle is on, and you can see one of the police officers, I think it was the passenger in this case, said, "Wow, when I get this guy, I'm going to kill him, right? I'm done with it, right?" And he was really angry, visibly. Well, the person who stole the car in the front crashed the car, and so they apprehended him, and they cuffed him and threw him into the back of the police vehicle. And as it turns out, eventually the whole scenario ends with the suspect, who had been apprehended and cuffed and thrown in the back of the vehicle, was shot to death. And so this was after the apprehension. Obviously, he was in the back of the cruiser in cuffs with his hands behind his back. And when the investigators came, they did the crime scene search, and they found there was a gun in the back seat, and the officer that was on duty that shot this person. His story was this: he had a gun on him. We didn't see it when we initially cuffed him and threw him in the back, but he was reaching for it. I had to shoot him. Now, some of the circumstantial features of this case were really interesting. Number one, the weapon that was used to shoot this individual in the back of the police cruiser was actually not a police-issued weapon. It was a private weapon, which was, it's illegal. A police officer is not supposed to use their own weapon to do this. But what's more significant is that the weapon that was found in the backseat of the car there were no fingerprints or DNA evidence whatsoever from the suspect who supposedly had this weapon on him. The gun itself was wiped completely clean to those sorts of things. There was no evidence of it having been fired or anything like that either. However, there was DNA evidence on the gun, but it was interior to the gun on the firing pin, and the DNA belonged to the police officer who actually shot the person who was in the car. Okay, so this is a pretty obvious case where there was a police officer that was setting up this person as a threat, and he planted evidence that the gun was there. And this is the kind of thing that went through the courts in St. Louis, and the black community in St. Louis was out there protesting when this was going through the grand jury indictment period. Because they knew what was going to happen. They knew this police officer was going to get away with this, and the evidence had been leaked through the media to where people knew about this gun and the DNA on the interior of the gun. So they were ready to protest the decision to not indict the officer on charges. And so they're all outside this courthouse, and the police forces in St. Louis at the same time were, outside the courthouse as well, because they just wanted to make sure that they stood up and prevented anything from going on. So they had the riot gear and all this. And as soon as the judgment came in, it was a acquittal, or I don't know if you call it necessarily acquittal, but there was no indictment made on the police officer, and the protests started getting vocal. And during this protest, you actually had the police officers in their riot gear making a counter protest, speaking back to the protesters and saying, and they were chanting, "Whose streets? Our streets. Whose streets? Our streets." And this was actually a chant that was used during the Michael Brown scenario. And so you can tell it was like this mimicry or this mocking of what was taking place. And this is the attitude, the kind of thing that she's talking about, that is not good in general. It doesn't help the situation at all. right? You have this attitude that comes down from the police officers in these situations that is kind of directly confrontational with the community that is protesting their very behavior. Okay. Now here's what's important. This is a one time, like this is something that was really happened. And so there is data that supports, there is information that supports Gloria Brown Marshall bringing this up and challenge against like the idea of policing being racially biased. But here's the problem: it is still a rare circumstance. This is not the kind of behavior that you're normally going to see from the police officers, right? Um, so that's what the distinction between context and data, like that's what this is meant to kind of tease out. Is this happening in more places than we think it is the media presenting it as if it is? Again, we need to be careful when we see these singular situations and making too big of a judgment from them. Now, with that being said, I do want to kind of bring up this kind of a side issue that relates into our topic of racial injustice, and that has to do with the very claim that these police officers are making. Whose streets? Whose streets? Whose streets are these? Right? Like, are they the police officers' streets? Or are they the citizen streets? The answer is yes. They belong to all of us, right? These are not the kinds of things that are owned. And so we need to take that and recognize that we can't just kind of treat these circumstances as if one side is the owner and the other side is just kind of they're receiving grace benevolently from the owners, right? No, the streets belong to the police officers and the people, and there has to be some recognition of that and respect for that. I think there's a really really interesting corollary in this whole Colin Kaepernick situation that we had going on in the NFL a couple of years ago. There was a lot of animosity towards Colin Kaepernick. Why? Because he was disrespecting the flag. Well, what flag? Well, the flag of the United States and the anthem of the United States. Well, why is this a problem? Why can't Colin Kaepernick disrespect, so a quote unquote disrespect, the flag or the anthem? And the implication, oftentimes the underlying implication behind that is that, well, that flag is the flag of the military, or that anthem is the anthem of the military, right? That was often, it's disrespectful to the military to do these sorts of things. And my challenge is that's basically saying, whose flag, my flag, whose anthem, my anthem, right? The fact of the matter is that flag and that anthem don't belong to just the military or some member of the service community. They belong to every American citizen. And they're supposed to be representative of things like free speech, the right to protest, right? The right to stand up against, against what perceived injustices, right? So to challenge Colin Kaepernick as if he's being somehow, disrespectful of the flag and anthem is to say that he doesn't have ownership of those things, which in fact is false. The whole concept of America is that the individual citizens have ownership of the national community in some way. Not full ownership, but a partial, a shared ownership, right? And if we recognize how many people were seriously and significantly affected by this whole debate and conversation, we realize that a lot of people, there is a general attitude in our country that people are given over to this idea like, this is mine, this is not yours. And I want to kind of fight back against that. Interesting corollary that, again, didn't come up in the debate specifically, but I think we should all think about. Second question that got brought up by the moderator has to do with the anecdotes. He says, why aren't these legitimate as evidence? We've already kind of addressed this in some way earlier when we were talking about the stop and frisk. Again, if 53% of the stop and frisk engaged a black subject and only 9% engaged a white suspect, this seems very meaningful since 60-something% of the population in America are white and only 13% are black. It seems like there's a huge disparity here. But if we look at the percentage of robberies and violent crimes that are happening within New York City. We realize that 75% of the shootings and 70% of the robberies are committed by the black community, and only 2% of the shootings and 5% of the robberies are committed by the white community. We start to realize that, you know what, if the stop and frisk was being used appropriately, then what we're looking at when we see 53% of stop and frisk engaging a black subject, we would recognize that no, actually, this data shows restraint in some way, right? And so it kind of you can dismiss the data itself. Now again, this all operates in the context that stop and frisk was being used in a constitutionally appropriate way, which it wasn't. So I'm not defending the policy by any means, but the statistical argument does seem to work back in favor of the side arguing that it doesn't actually show bias here. Third question that got brought up: how are we defining violent crime, and why are we only focusing on violent crimes? I think that this argument is the heart of the circumstances that are really important here. That really kind of should have swayed the debate in one way or the other. Basically, here's the response that was brought up. If we include all crimes, whites commit more overall, but they're not arrested in proportion with the crimes committed. This is the challenge from the side that says policing is racially biased. They are going to say, look, violent crimes aside, in some sense they might say we can admit the statistics on violent crimes, and yet that doesn't tell the whole story. Let's look at nonviolent crimes, and we will see that the nonviolent crimes make it very clear that the black community is being systematically oppressed. The side that's saying the side against that, the side that's saying there is no injustice in policing, is going to argue that, look, 100% of homicides, a majority of other violent crimes are reported. Right? These are things that are reported appropriately. There's no question about whether there are crimes that are happening that's not, now again, there was some pushback from the audience here, but in general, they're probably right. Like murders and violent crimes of that sort, like most of them are identified, right? There's not as many of them that aren't. Whereas when you deal with nonviolent crimes, like we're not even scraping the surface of how many of these are happening. And getting prosecuted. And so his idea here is if we look at violent crimes, we have a very good set of numbers to tell us what the proportionality of criminality is, and then we should be able to reflect that and apply that into other scenarios, right? So I want to bring up an argument in support of the side that says policing is racially biased and really push their point forward here, because again, I think this is really important. So what I've done is I've compiled a number of statistics here from data going from, let's see, I think 2016 is some of it. I brought it from multiple sources because this is not all found in one place. I wanted to compile it together. But here's what I put together. So we have the first column here is general population. You see that you have 61% white, 12%, 13% or so black, 70% Hispanic. Again, Hispanic's kind of a category that it's hard to find the specific because you have non-white, you have white Hispanic, black Hispanic, non-white or black Hispanic. So you have different kind of designations, but these are the general numbers I think as of 2000, as of the most recent census information. Then you have the next column, which says illegal drug use in the prior month. Now this column here was based upon, let me see if I have it. This was based upon self-reporting. Okay, so basically there was a survey done, and gosh, I had the information here. I think this was done in 2016 by this. It was called the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, SAMHSA.gov, and so it's a government-run survey, and again, self-reporting, and you had 9.5% of the white community admitted to using illegal drugs in the previous month, 10.5% of the black community, and 8.8% of the Hispanic community. What do we see here? That according to self-reporting, okay, generally speaking, the different racial communities will admit to using illegal drugs at very similar rates. If we look at the next column over, we see illegal drug use in the prior year. So we're going back more than a month here. And this was a 2003 survey, but it was the best I can find. And you can see the numbers there. 38.2% of the white community, 30.6% of the black community, 27.5% of the Hispanic community admit to using illegal drugs. And this is between the ages of 18 and 25. So this is more the demographic that's kind of involved in that we'll find oftentimes like getting incarcerated for the first time or for extended periods of time. And we realize that in these numbers that a higher percentage of the white community self-admits to illegal drug use in the prior year. Okay? Now, my suspicion here is that the black and Hispanic numbers may be kind of suppressed a little bit because of in these scenarios, because you have a particular age group, 18 to 25, which is going to be in general more suspicious of police officers themselves, and we know that minority communities have more suspicion towards police officers. There's probably going to be less acknowledgement of criminal activity. Like, you're not going to say, yeah, I'm committing crimes, right? I've committed crimes the last year. There's going to be a little bit more suspicion there that this is going to come back and hurt you. And so my bet is that this is probably really closer to even across the board. We're probably looking at something like 38 to 40% for, or 35 to 40% for all of these categories. Okay. So what do those first three columns represent? The second and third columns, they're just columns that I'm using to justify my claim that different racial demographics use illegal drugs at virtually the same rates. Okay? Now let's move over and look at the next two columns. Federal convictions, trafficking, right? This is federal charges. You have 0.1%, 0.01% of the white community, okay, 20,664 people, were convicted of federal trafficking charges in, I don't have the year on that one. I had it somewhere, but I must have lost it. In the particular, maybe that's overall. 0.1% of the population is in jail for federally in jail for trafficking charges, whereas within the black community you have it being 8%. So it's 8 times higher, right? 36,688 people. So you have more people in that community who are in jail for trafficking than you have in the white community. Now, here's my suspicion for these numbers here. What this is basically telling you is that, people who sell drugs, you are much more likely to be caught. You are much more likely to be a drug trafficker if you're black than if you're white. Selling drugs if you're black than if you're white. And while we'll look at some statistical evidence that maybe can support why that would be the case, we're going to look at that a little bit later on, or we're going to talk about some anecdotal evidence later on that might explain why this is true. The question is, initially, should we suspect that it is true? Because like most crimes, most communities, we're pretty, in general, in America, we are a segregated community. Now, we're not legally segregated, we're practically segregated. What does this mean? That typically speaking, within a black community, you have members of the black community often are going to have interactions with other members of a black community, and the same thing with the white community. You go into a church in a black community, it's going to be mostly black individuals in that church. You go into a church in a white community, it's going to be mostly white individuals in that church. That's how, for better or for worse, America rolls. Okay, and so with that said, and this represents itself in the violent crime numbers as well, whereas we see that most crimes are either black on black or white on white. You don't have a whole lot of kind of racial situations where you have white on black or black on white crime, right? It just doesn't happen at high rates. Why? Again, because because of our segregation, that's how things happen. If that's the case, and if white people then are using drugs at the same rates, illegal drugs at the same rates as other groups, well, then you would expect that the drugs are coming in to these white homes through white traffickers, right? I mean, if people are operating primarily in their own communities most of the time, you might be suspicious that, well, wait a minute, shouldn't the percentage of population who are traffickers be pretty similar in the white community to the black community, given that kind of setup? I think that's a good question, and I think that There's probably a lot of truth to that, but there is a bit of some details that we're going to be able to look at here shortly that kind of will help us to see why there might be a disparity. So I'll get to that eventually. Uh, the next column over is even more problematic, and that's when we look at state drug convictions as far as possession goes. And what we recognize is that 55% of convicts in jail for possession who receive, not necessarily jail, not everybody gets jail time, but 55% who receive either jail or some other penalty are actually white, and 43% who receive jail or some other penalty are black. And so we start to recognize, well, wait a minute, like, we have more white people in jail or more white people who have drug convictions than black people. Maybe that undoes altogether the disparity that we're seeing, right? But let's move it forward a little bit and look at the rate of state convictions, because we can't just look at the overall population totals, but use a population benchmark for judging who's in jail, right? We need to compare that to the rate of the overall rate of population. And what we see here is that the amount of people who get convicted on state drug charges in the white community, you basically have 25.3 people out of every 100,000. Okay? Whereas within the black community, you see we have 256 out of every 100,000. In other words, you basically have 10 times the rate of people within the black community getting arrested as you do within the white community. Now, why is this meaningful? Why is this more meaningful than the convictions claim? Because we have self-admittance that of possession or of use of drugs, statistics that show that it's basically equal within all racial demographics. In other words, state convictions are going to track usage or possession. They're not tracking violence, they're not tracking trafficking, they're tracking usage or possession. And if we already have admitted equality of use or possession in these second and third columns, then we should expect that last column to look similar to each other. But we have a 10-time disparity. This tells us that you are 10 times more likely to get busted for possession in the black community than you are in the white community, even though you use drugs at essentially the same rate within these communities. That's where the racial disproportionality comes in. And I think that's a really important statistic that we need to look at. Does this prove that police are racially motivated or have racial prejudice? No. What this proves is that there is statistical justification for arguing that there is institutional bias in the way that these crimes are prosecuted and convicted. Okay, that's the heart and soul of what I think that the policing is racially biased side should be arguing. Sorry, by the way, I didn't have statistics there on Hispanic. They just weren't included in those studies there. So I'm presuming that Hispanics get kind of wrapped up into the black and white populations there. So we'll just kind of set that one aside. Fourth question that came up during moderator questions: how does one deal with the clear evidence that violent crime is significantly more predominant in minority communities? There are a lot of really poor responses to this. In other words, here's what the moderator is asking. Look, if the minority communities have more violent crime, isn't that where we want the cops to be? And if the cops are there, aren't they going to see these other crimes? And if they're seeing these other crimes, don't they have a responsibility to prosecute them, to uphold the law? That's a really good set of questions from the moderator. The side arguing that policing is racially biased, they went through a series of bad arguments. First, they said white males are violent too. They make up the majority of mass murderers. This is what's called a red herring. This has nothing to do with the context. It doesn't push forward the argument at all. It's going off the pace of what the argument's supposed to be referring to. After this, they say, okay, fine, the point's conceded, but it doesn't justify the treatment of non-murderers. But in some cases, it does justify, yes, it doesn't justify the treatment of non-murderers because they have the same skin color. Certainly doesn't justify it. But if the cops are present in these places because of the violence, it does seem to justify more suspicion. And when you have suspicion, you need to be kind of watching out for these things. I mean, a lot of times, drug trade is tied up with violence in a lot of these very violent communities. And so when you're looking at drug use and you're looking at drug possession for the sake of trying to stem off the violence, that's not completely irrational. But I think there's a better answer that can come from the side that's arguing that policing is racially biased, and they could have pointed out the statistics. They can use statistics to kind of justify their claim. So what I've done here is bring up some information about crime in Chicago in 2016. I picked Chicago because it's known to be one of the more violent cities in the nation. Okay, so what I've done here, and I'm making some very worst case assumptions. I'm trying to build an argument and stack it against the side that says that policing is racially biased. Okay, so here's what we have. The black male population in Chicago during 2016 was about 402,854. Okay, so 402,000 black males. The total number of murders in Chicago in 2016 was 762. Of those 762 murders, 543 were committed by citizens within the black community. So that's a rate of 71%. So we can see that the rate of murderers is much higher within the black community than it is the other community in Chicago. Most of the murders are happening in a black neighborhood with a black victim and a black assailant, as Heather McDonald acknowledged. Total shootings, there were a total of 3,550 shootings in 2016 in Chicago, and I presumed, and this is an estimate that I'm making, that let's just say that 2,532 of them were committed by the black community, members of black community, because it's going to track with the same number of murders. Now, this is probably false, right? The numbers can go in either direction, but they didn't have statistics on who was doing the shootings because you have less information that comes in, less witness reports and those sorts of things that will come in from the shootings. So presuming that the same disparity here, I use that as a way to generate two ratios. Okay, the first one is the worst case of ratio of citizens to murderers. Now, here's how I came up with that number. I assumed, and this is a ridiculous set of assumptions, but it's in a set of assumptions that's made to make it harder for the side arguing that there's racial injustice to make their case. In other words, I'm trying to make it the case that there's as many, the most possible number of murderers that you can have within the black community in Chicago is 1.3 out of 1,000. In other words, here's what I'm assuming: that every single one of the murders committed by black individuals within Chicago in 2016 was committed by a distinctive black male. In other words, I'm presuming there's no females that committed these murders, and that nobody committed more than one murder. Those are ridiculous. There are probably plenty of females that are involved in this, and probably lots of people who committed more than one. I mean, you might have one person responsible for 15 of these things, right? Why am I making these assumptions? Because if I didn't make these assumptions, the number above the 1.3 out of 1,000 would actually be smaller. Let's say that, for example, 20% of the murders committed by black individuals in Chicago were committed by women, just for the sake of argument. Well, now that's going to reduce that 1.3 by 20%. Right, and so let's say that it reduces it by 20%. Now you're talking about 1 out of 1,000, roughly. A little bit more than that. And then let's say that the total number. Let's say that the average person who was a murderer in Chicago killed 1.5 people. And so what would that mean? That would reduce the total number of murderers down by 33%, which would put us from 1 to like 0.6. And so now you'd have basically 6 out of 10,000 people who are murderers, right? So that's why I do the numbers this way. I'm trying to kind of get the highest number on top to still show that the proportionality of the response is absurd. Okay. Same thing I did for the shooters. I assumed that for every one of those 2,532 shooters, that it was a different shooter every single time, and that it was always a male, it was never a female. Again, ridiculous assumptions. What does that leave us with? The idea that there are 6.3 out of every 1,000 black males in Chicago have committed a shooting in 2016. Okay, so here's the question I want you to think about. If only 1 out of 1,000 people are a murderer, and 6 out of 1,000 people are are violent criminals who are shooting people, does that justify targeting a whole population type with stop and frisk type policies? With looking at, in the case of murder, so let's just, I mean, obviously the murderers, they're going to be included into the shooters. So let's just take the shooter's number. Does that justify treating the other 993.7 people with suspicion? Are we really going to look at that like 99.3% of people suspiciously because of what 0.7% of people do? That's an absurd way to respond, right? And so this is what, when they were talking about the broken window policy earlier, this is the kind of thing that they're justifying. They're saying we should look at with suspicion on people within these communities because, targeting these lower level crimes, it's good at helping us to stop the higher level crimes. If you penalize people for broken windows or drug crimes, then what you're going to do is you're going to lower the violence that's happening in these cities. And a lot of times the successes that happen in New York will be basically blamed upon, right? The ability, they'll be used to justify the action. Why is New York used? Well, if you remember earlier in the debate, Heather McDonald said, some of us remember this is Hell's Kitchen, now it's a hipster mecca. She's basically saying that zero tolerance worked. Zero tolerance, like going after a broken window policy, by going after minor drug crimes, you've gotten rid of the violent crime in the city. And the truth of the matter is that's not really what did it. Going after those crimes put a lot of people in jail. And putting a lot of people in jail opened up the possibility for corporations to come in and buy up the block, right? To buy up a lot of these communities and to do what's called gentrify them, to go in and dump a whole lot of money into these places and make them inaccessible to impoverished people, which has essentially gotten rid of the crime because the crime is easier to track when we're talking about economics than it is than we're talking about race. I'm going to bring that up a little bit later on, okay? So again, my main point here was just to show how a better argument could have been made on behalf of the side that says policing is racially biased by saying, look, you shouldn't be treating whole groups of people with suspicion just because they live in areas where violence happens, because even in those areas, the incredibly vast proportion of people are nonviolent and generally law-abiding citizens, or at least law-abiding in proportion of population that would reflect what you find in other people groups. Okay. All right, so that leads us to the final kind of section here where we talk about the audience questions. There were some really interesting topics that get brought up here. One of them was the school to prison pipeline. I was going to play a video here, but we're already 90 minutes into this discussion and I don't want to kind of extend this on. So you can look up videos on YouTube to learn about the school to prison pipeline. There's one statement that was made that I really want to get you guys to think about. And that statement was about how private prisons will use testing that happens in, I think, the 4th grade to determine what their population will look like 10 years down the road, right? In other words, they use the test and say, okay, these communities are doing poorly on these tests, so probably this percentage of these people will end up in jail, so we need to go ahead and start planning to build larger facilities or buy more beds or do these sorts of things so that we're ready when these folks are ready for jail. Okay? Now, these are corporations. Corporations don't make these sorts of decisions willy-nilly. And they're not trying to cause the people to go to jail. They're reading the data. So I don't want to read malicious intent into this. It's not like they're forcing people to be criminal. But here's what I want you guys to think about. If a corporation is making these large-scale economic decisions, they're only going to do that because they have good reason to believe that the statistics mean what they say they mean. And so they're making wise, reasonable judgments about how to spend money. Okay? But they're doing this for the sake of putting people in jail. If you can tell, based on testing, what percentage of people was going to end up involved in a life of crime 10 years from now, wouldn't it be a better idea to take that money and try to invest it in preventing these people from becoming criminal, in improving education, in improving access to the things that would prevent them from becoming criminal in the first place? That is a huge injustice that I see happening here. That we can tell that better education will lead people away from a life of crime, and yet that's not what we invest in. Okay, so that's a big issue that's related to the school to prison pipeline. Second significant topic: mass incarceration. Um, there's a documentary that I'm going to request that you guys all watch, and it has to do with the 13th Amendment, which we talked about earlier. It's called The 13th. It's a Netflix documentary. If you haven't watched this documentary, then you really have no right to kind of talk about the role that race plays within the justice system area. You need to watch this documentary to get a feel for how it has increased and how it's been racially disproportionate historically. Okay, so again, I was going to play a little short video here as well. You can see the title of the Bruce Western on mass incarceration. If you want to go to YouTube and look that up, go for it. Okay. The third thing that I want to talk about, and this is kind of my final kind of commentary that I give every time I teach this class in a seated fashion, and it's my commentary on where the context really helps out. So a lot of the issues that we talked about before, we kind of dismiss the idea of context being relevant when we're talking about the media presentation of mass shooting. I'm sorry, of well, it applies to mass shootings as well, but in particular police shootings, where we talk about the injustices that happen, where we're looking at certain elements of context. It can easily be the case that by listening to the context, we get the idea that a problem is more problematic than it really is. Okay, but I think that the topic of economics did not come up enough in this discussion, and in my personal opinion, I think economics is where systematic injustice really rears its ugly head in our nation, right? And where it plays itself out at a racial level, especially. Okay, so let me give you. I'm going to start off by just giving you a narrative. Okay, and I'm going to invite you into this narrative, and I want you to imagine that you. Let's take you, uh, your grandparents, and your parents. Okay, you, your grandparent, and your parent are going to play a game of Monopoly with your best friends, your best friend, their grandparent, and their parent. Okay, and we're going to do this generationally. So you're going to sit down. Your grandparents are going to sit down, and your grandparent is going to establish the rules for the game of this Monopoly game. And here's what they're going to tell you. We're going to play this game, but you are not allowed to purchase any properties on this board. So your side gets to purchase them, but your opponent's side, your best friend's grandparent, they're not allowed to purchase any properties as they go around the board. Okay, so let's say that they play around the board 2 times. Okay, and so they play around the board 2 times. What's the board going to look like? Well, the board's going to be set up so that any property that's owned, any houses that are on the board, are going to be owned by your family, right? They're your family's houses. The other team has not been allowed to purchase properties. Now, generally speaking, as they've gone around the board, they probably haven't really landed on too many of your properties because only so many spots are going to be landed on during the first couple of years, and so it's not like they paid out of pocket for a lot of this stuff. Like they're not paying a negative price yet for any of this, but they don't have any possessions as they go around. That's the main idea. So from a bank account standpoint, it might be fairly even, but or you're actually your neighbor might be a little bit ahead, right? But they don't have any possessions to go along with this. So let's say then your grandparents, they stand up and they walk away, and the parents sit down, okay? And your parent looks at the board and they're discussing it with your best friend's parent, and they're saying, look, this game wasn't very fair, right? Like, you should have been able to purchase some houses, some properties along the way. So let's reverse that and fix the rule for you. Let's allow you now to purchase anything that you land on. We're just going to keep, we'll keep going, and you can purchase properties from now on. We'll make our rules equal for you and me. Okay? So they set up the situation and they go around the board a couple of times. What's going to happen? Well, probably this is what's going to happen. As you're going around the board these couple of times, they're going to be able to land on a property here and there that was unpurchased, right? So they're going to be able to purchase a property from time to time, maybe if they're fortunate, right? They land on it, depending on when they land on it. Okay, so if they land on it, like let's say the first turnaround this time, they land on a property, they're going to have some money, they can buy it. But let's say that instead of landing on their property the first time, they roll and they land on a property that was already bought up by you. Well, then that means they're going to have to pay you for rent on that property, right? They're going to have to pay you out of their bank account for landing on your property. And then let's say that they take another round, and then unfortunately they land on another one of your properties, right? And so they're going to have to pay you rent for that one. And then the next turn that they run, they land on an open property. The problem is though that they've already paid rent on properties as they've gone around the board, and so their bank is actually diminished. So even though they have the right to purchase that property, they don't have the bank to be able to do it, right? Why? Because they've had to pay you for your properties. Meanwhile, as you're going around the board and you're landing on new properties, you're able to buy them at virtually the same rate that you've been able to buy them before. As a matter of fact, you might even be able to buy them at a higher rate because now you've got a second kind of source of cash flow that's coming in from the rents that you're receiving from your opponent in this game. I'm sorry, I should be saying your parents here. But the idea here is that as you're going around this next couple of times, even though the rules have been made equal for either side, right? It's nobody's being discriminated against on who can buy what anymore. The status of the game or the setup of the game from the first two rounds has already affected how this next couple of rounds is going to play itself out, right? And by the time you've gone around the board a couple more times here, you may be lucky to see a property or two that's actually owned by your friend's side of the board, but the vast majority of the properties are going, if not all of them, are going to be owned by your family. And not only that, but your bank account is going to be, if not equal to, higher than your opponent's bank account in this scenario, right? So let's imagine your parents get up and now you're going to sit down with your friend and you realize, wow, this game has been really stacked and it's really impacted the way that it's turned out. I mean, this board, it's completely unfair. We can acknowledge that. Let's come up with a new system that helps us to kind of moderate this. Instead of, just keeping things equal, obviously that's not going to work. Let's find a way to kind of give you, a little bit more advantage than what I get. So instead of, you collecting $200 every time you pass go, let's give you $2,000 every time you pass go, and I'll keep collecting only $200, but you can keep $2,000. We'll call it, HUD money, food stamps, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to give you all that money, and then every time you go around the board, and that will help even things out, right? Well, no, that's not going to even anything out because guess what? Most of the properties on the board are already bought up, and so what's going to happen? That $2,000 or $1,800 extra, that $2,000 a month or every time around the board that you're giving to the individual, all that's doing is extending the game to last longer because now they can keep landing on your properties more without running out of money, right? And so that money ends up finding its way into your bank accounts anyway because the board is already stacked in your favor, right? What's the point of all this? How does this relate to our systematic injustice discussion about race in America? Here's how. In our own national history, and we don't have to go all the way back to the slavery period, we don't have to go all the way back to the 20s and all this. Let's just go back to World War II. After World War II, when all of our military came back from overseas, we had to create a new economy. Okay? And part of the new economy had to do with building new sectors of America, neighborhoods, suburbia, basically, right? And in order to kind of push this forward, they created two military programs. One was the program that had to do with college tuition, and one had to do with home purchasing, right? And so anybody who came back who had served in World War II was now going to be eligible to receive the grants that came through these programs. Sorry, I misspoke. Anybody who was white who came back from these wars was going to be able to use these grants and be eligible for these programs. So what happened? The people who were white took advantage of them. So now you had the the people who had fought in the wars were coming back, and they were going to college, and they were buying homes, and they were establishing equity and all of these things for themselves that would, over the course of the next roughly 30, 40 years, increased tremendously in value. I mean, if you've ever talked to somebody who bought a house in the early 50s, they'll probably tell you, yeah, I bought this house for $9,000 or for $14,000. And if they lived in those houses in, let's say, 20 years, which was pretty common back then to live in the same house for 20, 25 years, they would have probably sold those houses for upwards of, $100, $115, $120,000. And so if you're talking about, buying a house in 1955 and selling that house in 1980, you probably quadrupled your money at minimum. Right, and then you bought another house in 1980 that was, a pretty, let's say $70,000, $80,000. That if you hold on to that one for 10 years till 1990, 1995 maybe, you're probably selling that one at double the rate that you originally purchased it for. And so you have this situation where people are, given the opportunity to buy something that has the ability to increase their overall, economic status from the standpoint of having nothing to having something. But the minority communities were not allowed to participate in these plans until somewhere around the 70s. And so you had 25, 30 years where the white community was allowed to both become educated in new in new fields of inquiry and new areas of job growth, and to develop their wealth at a time when the black community was not allowed to do these things. Well, eventually this situation would get rectified, and these programs would be made back available for the minority community, who's already significantly behind the gun. And this would have been kind of the late 70s and the early 80s. Okay. And so what happens at this time? Well, they're allowed to start participating in these programs, but they don't really have the wealth to buy the houses now at the increased rates that they've kind of developed into during this time period. Right, so if you bought a house for $9,000 in 1950, and now that same house is going for $65,000 in 1975, like, how are you going to come up with all of that extra money? It's not like the economy has increased that much for you. You don't have the kind of jobs that have increased in value with the economy, and so you still really can't buy these houses. And so what ends up happening is that certain programs get opened up through the housing and urban development that allow for people to get zero interest loans, or to receive grants, or to be guaranteed the right to purchase a house, right? And these are often targeted to people who are moving out of the projects, or into suburban neighborhoods. Excuse me. And so these programs come up, and at first they're not really working, because there's this process that's going on called redlining in these suburban communities. And basically what redlining is, it is banks identifying particular neighborhoods that they are not going to give loans for, okay, because of crime rates and that sort of thing. And these neighborhoods were almost universally minority-type neighborhoods. So where minorities were able to buy houses, the banks were stopping giving loans for those sorts of places. Or at least that was the plan to, right? And what ends up happening with this is that realtors then are starting to they're starting to make the judgment that these high crime areas have more to do with being minority than anything, and so they're no longer showing houses to minorities in neighborhoods that are good, so to speak, right? That are still receiving bank support, and so you have kind of a segregation that's happening because of the action of realtors. Now, redlining eventually would become illegal, and when it became illegal, the realtors got smart, and they realized, okay, well, we're not going to be able to redline anymore. So they went around to all the people in these neighborhoods, and they explained to them that, look,
there is a massive number of people out there who are being guaranteed loans now, and we can't keep them from moving into your neighborhoods anymore. So if you want to keep the value, or if you want to continue prospering, then you better sell your home right now, because soon, the people who have all the crime and the people who don't have a lot of money, they're going to be moving in here, and your value is just going to go down and down and down. And what they did is they perpetuated this kind of movement that was called the white flight movement, whereas all of a sudden the members of the white community were all at once putting their houses on the market and moving to different areas of the region. Okay, now why is this important? Well, part of the government programs that were developed to give zero interest loans and help people with down payments and that sort of thing, um, to kind of help offset the housing crisis within the minority community. The whole concept behind doing this was that if you can get the people out of the projects and into the suburbs, then they would be where the jobs are. See, when in the projects there are no jobs, or at least not any kind of good paying jobs, and so what would happen would be that you'd have this scenario where there was no way to help people get to work, no way to help people kind of pick themselves up to develop their own economy, and so you're trying to help them figure that out. And the idea is that if you spread all the people without jobs out in the areas where they do have jobs, well, then this is going to be a way that they can kind of get the access. Okay, so that's the thinking. But it backfired, because what happened is that all the people who owned the businesses in these suburban communities, when they got wind that the people from the projects were going to be moving in, they sold all at once. And in doing so, they benefited in two ways. Number one, they were able to buy up cheap property wherever the new neighborhoods were that they were moving to, because there were no amenities in these places yet. They were developing the communities. Two, because so many people were qualifying for these HUD programs, there was so much demand for their houses that they were actually getting higher rates for the housing than they would have if everything would have just stayed the same. So they actually, because of the HUD program, their property values shot through the roof. And so what you had was people who were moving out of the projects, moving into the suburban areas with the intention of being around jobs and having something of their own, home ownership, and all of a sudden they get there and the jobs have all left, and now they're strapped with this mortgage bill that they didn't have before, and their property values, because all the businesses have moved down, have all at once just shot through the floor. In other words, the property values were high because they had schools, they had businesses, they had demand for the houses, and now all of a sudden all the businesses leave, which means all the tax revenue leaves, which means the schools are no longer any good, and your public services are going to be less, and now you have people living in the houses that can't afford them, and they paid more than they were worth. See, now you have people getting negative equity because they were finally allowed to buy a house. This happened in the 90s throughout all sorts of areas in America. I encourage you to watch a documentary about my own hometown. It's called Spanish Lake, and find that documentary, and you just got to get an idea of how this whole process played itself out, right? And so what's going on here? Well, even though this is relating to that last stage of the monopoly analogy, right? Where even though like you've all of a sudden increased the opportunities by saying, "Hey, here's some money, here's some help. Let's help you guys get on your feet." It doesn't actually work that way, because what ends up happening is that all that money that's going in, into the system, it all went to the people who already had it. Why? Because their property values shot up, and they were able to take that money and go buy cheap land somewhere else, and they're going to repeat the process and build up the property values there, and then presumably this is just what's going to happen later on, right? So this is the scenario that's happened in America. Well, what's happened as a result of a lot of this? Well, when you have bills to pay and there are no jobs in town, what do? You try to find some way to create a business. But banks aren't going to help you. You're in debt. You owe more on a house than it's worth, and you don't have a job. So you're going to have to find a kind of job that doesn't care about how much money you have up front. It's going to have to be a job that doesn't care about how much money you owe. And oftentimes, the only economies that you're going to find in these places are going to be unregulated economies, things like the drug trade. Okay? So the drug trade in the minority community is very much a reaction to the circumstances that led the minority communities to be in the poverties that they are, from not being able to take advantage of home ownership to when they were finally able to take advantage of home ownership being basically getting a bait and switch where they were promised the opportunity for wealth creation, and they ended up being in a position that really just sapped more digital wealth away from them, right? And then, you move into the mid to late 90s after this, we have another opportunity in America for people to become independently wealthy. It's the dot-com boom when the internet really started expanding. But guess what? People couldn't buy stocks unless they had some sort of equity. And many within the impoverished black community, they did not have any equity. They had negative equity, so they weren't going to be able to make investments. They still hadn't been able to go to college, right? I mean, they had the opportunity to technically go, but to get into college, it's not just a matter of saying, oh, well, you're a particular race, so you get to get in for free. I mean, they do have programs that are there to support minorities, but the support is predicated on the idea that you meet up to the academic qualifications that you need to start at the college. And the fact of the matter is, when you grew up in a poor community that didn't have money to spend on education, you're not going to get the baseline education that you need to pass the test to get pass the entrance exams on these colleges. See, there's this vicious cycle that plays in with the way that the housing market and the history of the housing market has affected the minority community. So again, if you have no jobs, you don't have a wealth generating mechanism other than the drug trade within the communities, and you need to feed your family and pay for your housing, what are you going to do? I would bet that virtually anybody who's listening to this video, if they were in a situation where they had to either let their children starve or do something illegal like go steal food from the market, I bet you're going to go steal food from the market. Like, you're going to do what you can to take care of your own, right? That's how this stuff works out. And so this is part of what led to the rise in the drug activity and the drug sales within a lot of these communities. And because it's an unregulated market, and because it's the only game in town that really has the chance to provide financially for people in these places, there becomes a lot of competition, and a lot of times this competition gets wrapped up in violence, and that's part of the explanation on why violence has sprouted in these communities. Now, I say that not trying to say that everybody who's in these communities is violent. We've already looked at the numbers in Chicago to see that, like, it's a very small percentage of the overall population who gets involved in the true acts of violence in these places. But the fact of the matter is, these minority neighborhoods are oftentimes more violent percentage-wise than other neighborhoods. And part of the explanation we can see really ties into the overall economic scenarios that they've had in these communities, right? And so, this can also be said about the incarceration problem. If the violence is there, the police are going to be there more often because the drug trade is the economy of these areas. It's going to be easier to catch people involved in the drug trade. This might explain why the federal numbers for prosecutions is 8 times higher in the black community than it is the white community, because selling drugs is the only economy that people have in many black communities, or historically it has been. And so there's just going to be more people who have to be engaged in that, because that's the way to actually make it economically to be able to put food on the table in a lot of these places, right? And so if those are the jobs that are available, but the cops are there because the violence is often surrounding the drug game, and the cops are seeing you involved in this, and this leads you to get more a record, more likely to have a record for possession or for intent to distribute or whatever it is that you might be getting caught with, and then all of a sudden you have a criminal record. Let's say that you're lucky enough to get out of these communities. Now what do you got to do? Well, you got to find a job in the new communities that you go through. But guess what? When you fill out the applications in these communities, what's going to happen? They're going to have that little question that says, have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony? And you have to answer them. They're allowed to ask that. And let's be honest, if you're an employer and you have 2 people apply for a job and they're relatively the same on paper, but one of them has a felony record and one of them doesn't, who are you going to hire? right? And so what does this do? It perpetuates the joblessness cycle. It perpetuates the cycle of the only real economy being the drug trade. This is the scenario that's happened in a lot of the black communities. And this isn't saying that it's happened to every black individual. It's not saying that it hasn't happened to white individuals as well, right? There are white people who are, have been in these poor communities, who've suffered similar fates. Like there's a lot of poverty in white communities as well. But a lot of times the poverty in those communities has been less systematically enforced and more a result of either historical accident or just the kinds of choices that people make, right? It's not as tied up with systematic policies as what you would see within the black community. So that's my basic argument that I'm trying to make. There's so much left that I've left unsaid here. You can go and do some research on, how much of the gang activity in places, especially like in LA, is a direct result of the way is a direct result, or it's a reaction to the way that the Black Panthers, for example, were treated in California, legally speaking, and the Black Panthers rising up was very much a result or a reaction to the way that the people like the Martin Luther King movement were treated, and in California prior to them, and you can kind of trace a lot of this stuff back to systematic preferences and intentional choices for one community to continue exerting control on another community, either primarily economically, and again, not out of necessarily some prejudicial hatred, though certainly that's going to play itself out in a lot of these situations, but most of the time just for the sake of getting rich. Okay, so that's where I think this discussion really should go. I personally believe that the debate as it played out was won by the side that said there's no racial bias in policing. And I think that the audience was right to vote in favor of that position, that side won. And I think that the side that said there's racial bias threw away their whole argument when they started talking about white serial killers. They didn't focus in on the economic realities. They didn't focus in on why there's a drug crimes. They didn't give the direct statistics about the number of people in prison to show that you're 10 times more likely to go to jail for being a drug user because you're black than you are when you're white, right? They didn't make the argument that, why is it that even though in the white community there's as much drug use as there is in the black community, how come violence isn't associated with drug use in the white community when it is in the black community? And the answer to that is because the white community has other economies. It doesn't have to result of violence to keep food on your table. There are other jobs that you can have. You don't have to be involved in the drug trade in these, in those communities to the same degree, right? These are all questions that didn't get brought up by the side arguing for racial injustice, and it's to their detriment in this debate. So my hope is that everybody who's listening to this, you can at least get some of the groundwork for the argument that goes into why we're in there's systematic racial oppression in our country, and that's admitting that there's a problem is, I think, part of what's needed in order to establish, or to work towards a solution, right? And I always get asked by my students, what would you do to solve this problem? And I'm not sure I have much of an answer, right? Like it's not just a simple redistribution of wealth, reparations kind of project. But I certainly think that it starts off with equalizing the economies as much as possible, and equalizing education as much as possible, and kind of pushing back, economically against some of the industries that have significantly profited off of this whole-scale systematic oppression. So take from that what you will. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I hope you guys continue to think about this. Feel free to email me with any kind of follow-ups that you would have. Have a good day.